It was nearing 2 a.m., and Jake had already resigned himself to another uneventful night. His phone battery was dying, his coffee had gone cold, and the only sound was the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above him. Just as he leaned back in his chair, ready to let his mind drift off into boredom, he saw it. A pair of headlights piercing through the darkness in the distance. At first, he thought nothing of it. Cars occasionally passed by this stretch of highway, but they rarely stopped. This one, however, slowed down as it approached the station. Jake straightened up, intrigued. It wasn't often that anyone ventured here so late at night. The car, a sleek black sedan with chrome accents, pulled up smoothly to pump number 3. Its engine purred softly, a stark contrast to the eerie stillness around them. Jake waited for the driver to step out, but no one came. Minutes ticked by, and the car just sat there, idling silently under the dim glow of the gas station's flickering light. He frowned, leaning forward on the counter. "That's weird," he muttered to himself. Curiosity gnawed at him. Maybe the driver needed help? Or maybe their car had broken down. Whatever the reason, it felt strange that someone would pull over and not even get out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake decided to investigate. Grabbing his flashlight from beneath the counter, he stepped outside, the cool night air sending a shiver down his spine. As he approached the car cautiously, his footsteps echoed against the pavement. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to sound confident. "Do you need any help?" There was no response, not a sound, just the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Jake hesitated before shining his flashlight into the car's tinted windows. What he saw, or rather didn't see, made his blood run cold. The car was completely empty. No driver, no passengers, just an open road map lying on the passenger seat and a faint trail of static coming from the radio. Jake froze, his heart pounding in his chest. How could this be possible? Where had the driver gone? And why did the car feel alive, almost as if it were watching him? Before he could process what he'd seen, the station's lights flickered violently, snapping him out of his trance. Panicked, Jake stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. When he turned to look again, the car remained eerily still, its headlights glaring at him like hollow eyes. Little did Jake know, this was only the beginning of a night he'd never forget. Jake's heart raced as he inched closer to the mysterious black sedan. His flashlight beam wavered slightly, betraying his growing unease. "Hello?" he called out again, louder this time, his voice cracking under the weight of his nerves. "Is everything okay? Do you need help?" Still, there was no answer, just the low hum of the engine and the faint crackle of static emanating from inside the car. Jake swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. He told himself it was probably nothing. A prank, maybe, or some tired traveler who'd stepped away for a moment. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Reaching the driver's side window, he leaned in cautiously, shining his flashlight through the tinted glass. At first glance, the interior seemed ordinary enough. Leather seats, a dashboard cluttered with papers, and an old road map sprawled across the passenger seat. But then it hit him, the car was empty. Completely, utterly empty. No driver behind the wheel. No silhouette in the rearview mirror. Just nothing. Jake blinked, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. He moved around to the other side of the car, checking every angle, but the result was the same. It was as if the driver had vanished into thin air. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he noticed more unsettling details. The keys were still dangling from the ignition, swaying ever so slightly as though someone had just touched them. And the radio, it wasn't playing any station. Instead, it emitted a soft, distorted static that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. A cold sweat broke out across Jake's forehead. "This isn't possible," he whispered to himself, taking a step back. His mind scrambled for explanations. Had the driver run off somewhere? Was this some kind of elaborate joke? Or was he losing his grip on reality? Before he could think further, the static on the radio grew louder, almost deafening, drowning out even the sound of the idling engine. Jake instinctively covered his ears, stumbling backward until he tripped over his own feet. As he fell onto the cold asphalt, the headlights suddenly flared brighter, blinding him momentarily. When the glare finally dimmed, Jake scrambled to his feet, panic overtaking reason. Without thinking twice, He bolted toward the safety of the gas station, slamming the door shut behind him. Breathing heavily, he peered through the smeared glass windows, half expecting the car to follow him. But it remained parked exactly where it had been, its engine still running, its presence taunting him. Confused, frightened, and unsure of what to do next, Jake realized one thing for certain. This night was far from over. Morning came slowly, dragging its feet as if reluctant to break the oppressive silence of the night before. Jake hadn't slept a wink. Every creak of the old gas station's floorboards and every flicker of the fluorescent lights had kept him on edge. The image of that empty car lingered in his mind like a stubborn shadow, refusing to fade no matter how hard he tried to shake it off. By sunrise, exhaustion finally forced him to close up shop and head home. But even then, peace eluded him. Sitting at his cluttered desk later that afternoon, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, Jake found himself scrolling through local news articles online. Something he rarely did. Maybe it was curiosity gnawing at him, or maybe it was desperation for answers. Either way, he couldn't stop thinking about the car. And then he saw it. Buried deep within an archive of old news reports was an article titled, "Tragic Accident Claims Life at Highway 17 Gas Station." Jake's breath hitched as he clicked on the link. The headline alone sent chills down his spine, but what followed made his blood run cold. According to the report, nearly 10 years ago, a young man named Daniel Harper had been speeding down Highway 17 late one night when he lost control of his vehicle. A black sedan with chrome accents, eerily similar to the one Jake encountered last night. The car crashed violently into pump number 3 of the very same gas station where Jake now worked. Daniel died instantly upon impact, leaving behind a grieving family and unanswered questions about why he'd been driving so recklessly. But that wasn't all. Scrolling further, Jake stumbled upon a comment section filled with eerie anecdotes from locals who claimed to have seen Daniel's ghost haunting the area. Some mentioned spotting his car parked near the pumps late at night, only to vanish moments later. Others swore they heard static-filled music or felt an icy presence whenever they passed by. Jake's hands trembled as he read the final line of the article. To this day, travelers claim the restless spirit of Daniel Harper still lingers at the site of the accident, unable or unwilling to move on. His stomach churned. It all fit perfectly: the car, the static, the emptiness. Everything pointed to one horrifying conclusion. Jake hadn't just met a random stranger last night. He'd come face to face with a ghost. As the weight of the revelation settled over him, Jake realized something else. He needed to figure out why Daniel's spirit was still here, and more importantly, whether there was anything he could do to help it find peace. Night fell again, and Jake returned to the gas station with a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He had tried convincing himself not to go back, that it was too dangerous, too strange, but something deep inside wouldn't let him abandon the mystery. The article about Daniel Harper haunted him. If this was truly Daniel's ghost, then maybe, just maybe, he could help put the spirit to rest. As the clock struck midnight, the world outside seemed eerier than ever. The wind howled through the trees like mournful cries, and the shadows cast by the flickering lights danced unnaturally across the cracked asphalt. Jake sat behind the counter, clutching a flashlight like a lifeline, when he saw them, the headlights. They appeared out of nowhere, glowing faintly in the distance before growing brighter as they approached. His heart sank. It was the same car, pulling up to pump number 3 once more. This time, though, the atmosphere felt heavier, colder. An invisible chill crept over his skin, raising goosebumps despite the warmth of the night. Jake hesitated, frozen in place. But curiosity, and perhaps a stubborn sense of duty, forced him to step outside. As he neared the car, faint whispers filled the air, barely audible over the hum of the engine. They were fragmented, unintelligible, but undeniably human. Shadows moved near the vehicle, darting just beyond the edge of his vision. "Daniel!" Jake called out tentatively, his voice shaking. "Is that you?" The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. The air turned icy, so cold that his breath came out in visible puffs. Suddenly, the station's lights began to flicker wildly, casting erratic flashes of light and shadow across the scene. Jake stumbled backward, panic clawing at his chest. He wanted to run, to get as far away from this cursed place as possible, but something stopped him. A memory surfaced. The article mentioned Daniel's family, their grief, his unfinished story. Whatever was keeping Daniel here wasn't resolved yet. Summoning every ounce of courage, Jake took a step forward. "I know who you are," he said firmly, his voice trembling but determined. "You're Daniel Harper, and I think you're stuck." At that moment, the car's headlights flared blindingly bright, and the static from the radio erupted into a deafening roar. Shadows swirled around Jake, forming the vague outline of a man. Through the chaos, one word echoed clearly: "Help." Jake realized then that running wouldn't solve anything. To break the cycle, he needed to face the truth and help Daniel find closure. The swirling shadows coalesced into a clearer form, a translucent figure standing beside the car. It was Daniel, his face pale and sorrowful, his eyes hollow yet filled with longing. Jake's breath caught in his throat, but he forced himself to stay rooted where he stood. He couldn't run now, not when Daniel needed him most. "You're still here because something's keeping you tied to this place," Jake said, his voice steadier than he expected. "What is it? What do you need?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, Daniel's ghost raised a trembling hand, pointing toward the passenger seat of the car. Jake hesitated before stepping closer, his heart pounding like a drum. Inside the vehicle, nestled among the scattered papers and maps, lay an old locket glinting faintly under the flickering station lights. Picking it up carefully, Jake opened it to reveal a faded photograph inside. A woman smiled back at him, a young woman with kind eyes and a warm expression. Beneath the photo was engraved a single word: "Forever." Understanding dawned on Jake. This must have been someone Daniel loved deeply, perhaps even the reason for his reckless drive that fateful night. Maybe he'd been rushing to see her, or maybe he'd never gotten the chance to give her the locket before the accident. "This belongs to her, doesn't it?" Jake asked softly, holding the locket out toward Daniel's ghost. "She's waiting for you, but you can't move on until this is resolved." Daniel's spectral form nodded slowly, his gaze softening as if relieved that someone finally understood. Jake swallowed hard, gripping the locket tightly. "I'll make sure she gets it," he promised. "You don't have to stay here anymore." As soon as the words left his lips, the air grew warmer, and the oppressive weight lifted. The car's engine sputtered and died, its headlights dimming until they winked out completely. Daniel's ghost lingered for a moment longer, mouthing a silent thank you, before dissolving into the night like mist carried away by the wind. Jake stood there, shaking but oddly calm, clutching the locket in his hand. The gas station was quiet again, peaceful even. For the first time in what felt like forever, the darkness didn't seem so menacing. Though shaken, Jake knew one thing for certain: some mysteries were meant to be solved, and sometimes all it took was a little courage and compassion to set a lost soul free. In the days that followed, life at the gas station seemed to return to its usual rhythm. Cars came and went, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above the pumps, and Jake resumed his nightly routine of manning the counter and keeping watch over the empty roads. But despite the outward normalcy, something inside him had shifted. He couldn't shake the memory of that night, the chilling whispers, the icy presence, and the ghostly figure of Daniel Harper. Every time he passed pump number 3, he felt a pang of unease, as if the echoes of the past still lingered there, buried beneath layers of asphalt and time. Yet, it wasn't fear that haunted him. It was a newfound respect for the unseen forces that might exist just beyond the veil of our understanding. Jake kept the locket safely tucked away in his pocket, reminding himself of the promise he'd made. He didn't know how or when he'd find Daniel's loved one, but he vowed not to give up until the task was done. In the meantime, he found himself paying closer attention to the world around him, listening more intently, observing more carefully, and treating every strange occurrence with a mix of caution and reverence. Though the experience had left him shaken, it also brought a strange sense of hope. Helping Daniel find closure had taught Jake an important lesson. Even the most tragic stories could have endings filled with peace, if only someone cared enough to help write them. On quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the trees and the shadows stretched long across the ground, Jake would sometimes glance toward pump number 3 and smile faintly. He imagined Daniel finally reunited with the woman in the photograph, free from the pain and regret that had bound him to this place for so many years. As the weeks turned into months, the gas station remained just as lonely as ever, but now it felt less ominous. To Jake, it was no longer just a desolate stop on a forgotten highway. It was a reminder of redemption, courage, and the enduring power of compassion. And though he never saw Daniel again, Jake knew one thing for certain. Some connections transcend even death, and some acts of kindness can change lives, whether living or lost. The clock struck midnight, and Dr. Ethan Cole sighed as he adjusted his glasses for what felt like the 100th time that evening. He sat alone in the dimly lit laboratory, a sterile yet eerily cluttered space tucked away in the farthest corner of the sprawling research facility. Outside, the world was shrouded in darkness. No streetlights, no passing cars, just an endless expanse of shadowy woods pressing against the building's walls. The silence outside was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of machinery inside the lab and the occasional flicker of the overhead fluorescent lights. Ethan had volunteered for the night shift again, not out of dedication, but because it gave him uninterrupted time to dig into the archives. Tonight, he was poring over records from decades-old experiments, his desk littered with dusty folders, yellowed papers, and faded photographs. Most of these files hadn't been touched in years, their contents long forgotten by everyone except the ghosts of the past. One particular folder caught his attention, a thick, weathered binder labeled Project Elysium. According to the notes, it was an ambitious experiment aimed at exploring the boundaries of human consciousness. But something had gone terribly wrong. A catastrophic failure during the final trial resulted in the death of one of the researchers, a young woman named Sarah, and led to the immediate shutdown of the project. As Ethan flipped through the pages, his unease grew. The descriptions were cryptic, almost ominous. Phrases like unstable energy fluctuations and anomalous neural activity jumped out at him. There were also warnings scribbled in red ink on the margins, notes left behind by panicked scientists urging caution. The atmosphere in the lab seemed to thicken with each page he read. The flickering lights above cast strange shadows across the room, making the stacks of equipment look like silent sentinels watching his every move. The hum of the machines grew louder, almost oppressive, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't truly alone. Still, curiosity drove him forward. What exactly had happened here all those years ago? And why did the lab feel so alive tonight? Little did Ethan know, the answers were closer than he thought, and far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Dr. Ethan Cole's fingers trembled as he turned another brittle page of the Project Elysium file. The deeper he delved, the more unsettling the details became. This wasn't just some routine experiment. It was a reckless dive into uncharted territory, an attempt to push the boundaries of human consciousness itself. The researchers had theorized that they could unlock hidden layers of the mind, perhaps even bridge the gap between life and death. But their ambition came at a cost. The records painted a chilling picture. On the night of the final trial, something went catastrophically wrong. A young researcher named Sarah, a brilliant but daring scientist, had volunteered as the test subject. According to the hastily scribbled notes, her neural patterns destabilized almost instantly during the procedure. One entry read, "Subject shows signs of dissociation, unable to terminate sequence." Another simply stated, "Containment breach imminent." Ethan's stomach churned as he pieced together what must have happened. Sarah hadn't just died. She had become trapped, caught in some liminal space between life and death, her consciousness tethered to the lab's equipment. There were no follow-up reports, no explanations beyond vague mentions of containment protocols being enacted. It was as if everyone involved wanted to bury the truth forever. As Ethan closed the folder, his unease deepened. The lab felt different now, heavier, colder. At first, it was subtle. The faint hum of the machines seemed louder than before, almost like a low, mournful wail. Then came the whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs drifting through the air, too quiet to make out but impossible to ignore. He glanced up sharply, scanning the room. The flickering fluorescent lights above him sputtered erratically, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Nearby, a stack of metal tools rattled on the counter, though there was no breeze to disturb them. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space. No response, just the oppressive silence, and those faint, persistent whispers growing louder with each passing second. His heart pounded as he realized the anomalies weren't random. They were centered around one specific area of the lab, the corner where the failed experiment had taken place. And suddenly, Ethan understood why the records had been buried. Whatever happened here years ago wasn't over. The whispers grew louder as the hours dragged on, weaving through the lab like an invisible thread. At first, Ethan Cole tried to convince himself it was nothing, just his imagination playing tricks on him or the hum of ancient machinery struggling under the weight of time. But no matter how hard he focused on the files scattered across his desk, the sound persisted, growing clearer with each passing moment. It wasn't just random noise, it was deliberate, almost pleading. Then came the movement. Ethan froze mid-sentence as he noticed a wrench slide ever so slightly across the counter beside him. He blinked, certain his tired eyes were deceiving him. Yet when he looked again, the tool had shifted further away, as if nudged by an unseen hand. His breath hitched, but he forced himself to stay calm. Faulty wiring, he muttered under his breath, though even he didn't believe it. Moments later, the monitors lining the walls flickered erratically. Screens that had been dark sprang to life, displaying static-filled images and cryptic lines of code scrolling too fast for him to read. One monitor flashed a single phrase over and over, "Help me." Ethan stumbled back, his pulse racing. Nearby, glass vials rattled violently on their shelves before toppling onto the floor with sharp crashes. The air grew colder, biting at his skin, and his breath fogged in front of him despite the warmth of the lab. Desperate to rationalize what was happening, Ethan checked the circuit breakers and inspected the equipment for malfunctions. But deep down, he knew this wasn't mechanical failure. It was something far more sinister. Every disturbance seemed to radiate from one specific corner of the lab, the same area where Sarah's tragic fate had unfolded years ago. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind as he realized the truth. This wasn't random chaos, it was intentional. Something or someone was trying to communicate with him. Ethan's hands trembled as he grabbed the Project Elysium file again, flipping frantically through its pages. There had to be a clue here, some way to stop whatever was haunting the lab. But as another wave of cold swept over him, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing behind him, he knew he was running out of time. Whatever force lingered in the lab wasn't going to wait much longer. Summoning every ounce of courage he could muster, Ethan Cole stepped toward the restricted section of the lab, the place where Sarah's life had ended so tragically years ago. His heart thundered in his chest as he pushed open the heavy metal door, its hinges groaning loudly in protest. Inside, the air was colder than anywhere else in the facility, and an oppressive weight settled over him, making it hard to breathe. The room was dark, save for the faint red glow of emergency lights mounted high on the walls. Shadows danced unnaturally across the surfaces, shifting and twisting even though there was no source of movement. Cold spots formed unpredictably, sending shivers down his spine whenever he crossed into one. It felt like walking through invisible patches of ice, each step heavier than the last. Then he saw it, a shadow darting across the far wall, too fast to be real. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but nothing was there. Just empty tables, rusted equipment, and the remnants of machines long abandoned. Yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing second, pressing against him like a physical force. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. Frost crept along the edges of the metallic surfaces, and the faint hum of machinery ceased entirely, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. From the corner of his eye, Ethan caught sight of something moving slowly, deliberately. He turned just in time to see a humanoid figure emerge from the darkness. It was Sarah, or at least what remained of her. Her form was translucent, flickering like static electricity, with wisps of energy swirling around her body. Her eyes glowed faintly, an unnatural light that pierced through the dimness of the room. She didn't speak, but her presence screamed volumes, radiating sorrow, anger, and desperation all at once. Ethan stumbled backward, his knees nearly buckling beneath him. Sarah? He stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The apparition paused, tilting its head slightly as if acknowledging him. Then, without warning, it began to move closer, step by agonizing step. Each footfall echoed louder than the last, reverberating through the room like a heartbeat. Overwhelmed with fear yet unable to look away, Ethan realized the truth. Sarah's spirit had been trapped here all these years, tethered to the lab by whatever failed experiment had claimed her life. And now she was reaching out, not to harm him but to seek help. But how could he possibly free her? Summoning every shred of courage, Dr. Ethan Cole took a deep breath and stood his ground as Sarah's ghost loomed closer. Her glowing eyes locked onto him, filled with an anguish that pierced straight through to his soul. Though fear coursed through his veins, he forced himself to speak. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "I know you're trapped here. Tell me, what do you want?" For a moment there was only silence. Then, faint whispers began to fill the air, fragmented, disjointed words that seemed to echo from all directions at once. "Free me," they pleaded, growing louder until they were almost deafening. As the whispers intensified, visions flashed before Ethan's eyes. Glimpses of the fateful night when Sarah had been pulled into the experiment. He saw the machine, a massive, pulsating device with tendrils of energy snaking outward, and realized it wasn't just a tool. It was a prison. Her consciousness had been tethered to it, unable to escape even after her physical body perished. Determined to help, Ethan sprang into action. Racing back to the main lab, he scoured the files for schematics of the original setup. His hands shook as he pieced together the location of the artifact, the core component of the experiment that still hummed faintly in the corner of the restricted section. The device was encased in a glass chamber, its surface etched with strange symbols and crackling with residual energy. As Ethan approached, the lights flickered violently, and the equipment around him sparked to life, as if fighting back. The temperature plummeted further, and Sarah's ghost reappeared, her form writhing in agony as if caught between worlds. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, gripping the control panel. With a final surge of determination, he initiated the shutdown sequence. Sparks flew, alarms blared, and the entire lab shuddered as the machine fought to stay active. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed like the effort would fail. But then, with a deafening pop, the device powered down completely. The room fell silent. The oppressive chill lifted, replaced by a warm glow. Sarah's spirit appeared one last time, her expression peaceful now. She mouthed a silent "thank you" before dissolving into the air, finally free. Exhausted but relieved, Ethan collapsed against the wall. The lab felt different now, empty, but not hauntingly so. The lab was eerily quiet now. The oppressive energy that had filled the room just moments ago completely dissipated. Dr. Ethan Cole sat slumped against the wall, his breaths coming in shallow gasps as the weight of what he'd just experienced began to settle over him. The once flickering lights above were steady now, casting a soft, even glow across the space. The hum of the machines had faded into silence, leaving only the distant sound of the wind outside. He glanced around the room, half expecting to see some lingering trace of Sarah's presence. But there was nothing, just empty tables, dusty equipment, and the remnants of an experiment that should never have been conducted. Yet, despite the calm, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the lab, but within himself. Helping Sarah find peace had given him a sense of purpose, a small victory amidst the chaos of the night. But it also left him with a profound unease. As a scientist, he had always believed in pushing boundaries, in seeking answers to questions others deemed unanswerable. Now, though he understood the cost of such ambition, science wasn't just about discovery, it was about responsibility. Crossing certain lines could unleash consequences no one was prepared to face. Ethan thought about Sarah, about the life she might have lived if not for Project Elysium. Her story was a tragic reminder of how easily good intentions could spiral into disaster. And yet, her release offered a glimmer of hope, a chance to make amends for mistakes made long before his time. As dawn broke through the windows, painting the lab in warm golden light, Ethan gathered the files and locked them away. He knew he couldn't erase what had happened here, but he could ensure that no one else would repeat the same mistakes. Walking out of the lab for the last time, Ethan felt both lighter and heavier, freed from the fear that had gripped him all night, but burdened by the knowledge of humanity's capacity to overreach. Science, he realized, was a double-edged sword. Used wisely, it could change the world for the better, but unchecked, it could destroy lives and souls. And with that sobering thought, Ethan stepped into the sunlight, ready to carry the lessons of the night forward.